Hello, everyone. This is Midori Komachi, and today I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Simon Heffer, a renowned journalist, columnist, and author of numerous books, including the biography of Enoch Powell and Vaughan Williams. And over the past few years, I've had the great pleasure of co-translating Simon's book on Vaughan Williams. Here it is. Into Japanese with Professor Nobuya Takahashi from Keio University. And our Japanese translation is due to be published in Japan this autumn. And today, I'd like to ask Simon a few questions about his book and some of his thoughts on the life and music of Vaughan Williams. So Simon, thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for asking me.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to ask a little bit about the background of your book and your approach in writing and telling the story of Vaughan Williams' life. And through reading your book, I became even more convinced about how important it is to consider Vaughan Williams not just as a composer, but a cultural figure, as you mentioned in your book, who contributed to the development of the national identity. And there are just so many different layers to his music other than this impression of folk songs or, pastoral style or, just thinking about, his most well-known piece, The Lark Ascending. So considering how much Vaughan Williams accomplished throughout his life and just the sheer volume of his significant musical output, it's so impressive how you have concisely put this together in just about 150 pages. And I was just wondering, how did you approach to writing this book?
Well, my then publisher, and in fact, it was originally published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson, and Faber and Faber subsequently published a paperback of it.
I see.
Weidenfeld were doing a series called Short Lives, and the restriction was 45,000 words. And I'm a historian, and I also write about politics, mainly political history. And they approached me to write a short life of Margaret Thatcher. And I said no, for two reasons. First of all, Mrs. Thatcher was still alive, and all the documents that one would have needed access to write a particularly intelligent book about her were unavailable and wouldn't be available until after her death. And second, I spent so much of my life writing about politics. I just, as you said, finished my life of Enoch Powell, which was 1,000 pages long and took me 4.5 years to write. That I wanted to write about something I was interested in recreationally or as a hobby, rather than something that was connected with my everyday work. So I said, can I write a book on Vaughan Williams? And they looked rather astonished. Well, why do you want to do that? Well, 20 years ago, the climate, or 22 years ago, the climate in this country about Vaughan Williams was rather different from how it is now. He'd gone through a period of intense neglect after his death in 1958. And when I was a young man, which sadly I'm not anymore, but when I was a young man in the late 70s and early 80s, it was very hard to find any concert performances of most of his works. As you say, The Lark Ascending has always been popular, so has the Tallis Fantasia, and one or two of the symphonies, notably the London Symphony and the Fifth Symphony. But that was about it. And it was very frustrating. I came to know Vaughan Williams's music when I was still at school, and it said something to me as an Englishman, very particular, not in a nationalist sort of horrible jackbooted way of that sort of extreme fascist nationalism that we associate with some parts of Europe, but something serene about what I consider to be the best values of my country, about its decency and tolerance and outward-looking nature. And so I'd always liked his music. And as I got older, I started to collect such books as there were on him. And I bought such music as was recorded, because again, until the early 80s, there wasn't really that much that had been recorded by him. And then later in the 1980s, I suppose about 1987 or 88 or 89, several people started to do cycles of symphonies, notably Leonard Slatkin, Bryden Thompson for Chandos, Bernard Haitink. And these were the first cycles that had been done for 20 years since Previn and Bolt had finished theirs, in Bolt's case, his second cycle. And suddenly Vaughan Williams took off. But the amount of music of his that was recorded, and he was championed by some younger conductors such as Richard Hickox, who was a great proponent of his work, and Vernon Handley as well, who also did a cycle of his symphonies. The amount of recorded music that he'd done was not reflected in the amount of writing about him. There was his widow Ursula's biography, which was pretty thorough, but there were certain areas of their lives that were skated over a bit. And Michael Kennedy's catalogue, which was slightly more rigorous, but was a catalogue. It wasn't really a biography, although it had biographical passages in it. And I thought there's nothing really out there for somebody who is coming to him for the first time and who perhaps doesn't want detailed analysis, doesn't want endless journeys off into private letters and everything else, but just wants a basic overview of who he was, what he did, and why he is important. And as you have alluded, and I'm grateful to you for doing so, it was that wider cultural importance of him that really mattered to me, and which continues 23 or 22 years later to matter to me very much about him, because I think that his posthumous reputation has evolved in such a way that he's now become a cultural figure in English life, comparable in terms of other composers to Elgar, who we've always considered to be the greatest of our 20th century composers. I think Vaughan Williams now challenges that idea. I think that Vaughan Williams was just as great as Elgar, if not greater. And he's a figure to be associated with, I think, writers such as Dickens or Milton or Shakespeare, painters such as Turner or Joshua Reynolds, or some of our great architects such as Wren or Gilbert Scott. And what I started to try to do in this book, and in other things I've written about him, mainly newspaper articles, over the last couple of decades, I've tried to build on this, is to talk about him as somebody who has become a cultural figure in our country who goes beyond music, but who represents something about English values, British values, if you like, and who is somebody through whom people from abroad can begin to interpret our country. I've always felt that, you see.